Welcome to the IDP Hunter Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Hungarter. As you guys know, I'm a writer and I'm an analyst over at the Fantasy Six Pack. And IDP guys, I'm also the number 4 ranker on Fantasy Pros. Tonight, I'm joined by a special guest, Dr. David Geier. He is a triple board certified orthopedic surgeon. David specializes in sports medicine. More particularly, he's a media medical expert in the field. How you doing, David?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Steve.
Now, should I say Dr. David? David?
David's fine. Yeah, no, I'm not real big. I don't feel strongly one way or the other.
Now, I wanted to kind of highlight and just give you praise about your book. I personally read a copy, and for my audience on Spotify, they can't see the screen. For those on YouTube, they can see it. I pulled up Amazon.com, and your book, That's Gotta Hurt, The Injuries That Changed Sports Forever, is available for everyone. What can you tell us about your book? What were you hoping that our audience can learn from your book?
So it was really a labor of love. It was an idea that my dad and I ironically thought of by text message a few years before it got published, where we were deciding some of the factors that affected sports the most, coaching changes and changes with the athletes and rules changes. And we came up with this premise that sports injuries and sports medicine have had a bigger impact on sports than just about any other factor. And so what, basically over the course of a night texting back and forth, we outlined 15, 17, 18 injuries, some of which people will remember, and then some maybe not remember, that maybe athletes they've never even heard of, but they had profound effects on sports in different ways, whether that particular injury led to rules changes, whether that particular injury led to basically taking that sport off of TV, whether it led to a new surgery, whether it led to a different training regimen. But all of them in their ways had a profound impact on how sports are played and how they will continue to play, because there's such a big part, not just at the pro level, but even all the way down to the youth level in people's happiness and satisfaction, and at the pro level in terms of millions and millions of dollars. And so it's really fascinating. Injuries that people are like, yeah, I vaguely remember that. They have no idea the changes that those injuries led to down the road. And everybody I've talked to that's a big sports fan really is interested in some of the parts of it that they didn't really see.
Now, you mentioned your father, and I assume y'all grew up watching sports together and everything. How long have you been an avid sports fan, and how long have you been in medicine? And what made you want to blend the two?
Yeah, so sports, as long as I can remember. I can still remember in Omaha, Nebraska, when he was a pediatrician in the Air Force up at Sac Air Force Base in Bellevue, Nebraska. We watched the Miracle on Ice. I'm old enough to remember that. Huge college basketball fan growing up. He went to Duke. I was a North Carolina fan, so that was kind of interesting. And then college football, and got into pro sports and just big fan. We don't have the same teams, but we still love sports and love talking about this kind of thing. And it's largely why I got into writing about sports. I had a newspaper column for years, wrote the book, obviously, looking at the evolution of sports and sports injuries. As far as the orthopedics, I went to medicine because I just thought, well, there's, always a good field in some form of medicine that'll fit my personality. And I very quickly realized, hey, look, I want to be a surgeon because I want to fix things. I don't want to just be managing symptoms my whole life. And very quickly, from being, a youth sports and travel sports athlete, and then running and lifting weights and all, it was such a big part of my life that orthopedics became the natural progression to that. And then after orthopedics, go into orthopedic sports medicine, worked with the St. Louis Cardinals and St. Louis Rams, and sort of had the bug. And then as I come here to Charleston, worked with a lot of pro sports teams and pro athletes. So it's been a big part of not just my career, my life.
Yeah, I'm kind of interested in what you have to say today, especially, applying your sports pedigree, your background, if you will, and your sports medicine, and combining the two onto this show. I'm not going to lie to you, Doc. I don't know anything about baseball and anything about medicine. So anything you have to say, I'm just going to soak it in. What I do is I do It's called IDP, Individual Defensive Players. So I'm more on the defensive side of the ball. I took the road less traveled, if you will. And, we just got off a couple podcasts. We were doing rookies this year. And I wrote some notes here for you. I wanted to pick your brain about a couple players, 2 particular rookies, if you will. The first one, and this is a real name. This isn't a Key and Peele episode, but this guy's name he's a defensive back. His name is Ennis Rakestraw. That's his name, Ennis Rakestraw. And he's a defensive back. He's longer. Not necessarily a big cover guy, but he's more at the line of scrimmage. He'll jam you up. He's a very physical player. Well, he's coming off a couple injuries. I don't know if you're familiar with the player, but he tore his ACL. And, always those kind of things are a bit touchy. Just basically by position. Defensive backs, they tend to tear their ACLs, their hammies, their feet, their toes a lot more often. Defensive linemen will jam their fingers, shoulders. Linebackers are more like side to side, like running backs, if you will. They'll tell ACLs, MCLs as well. But this particular player, Ennis Rakestraw, okay, he had an ACL. He bounced back from it, but he had a soft tissue tear, and I guess it popped back up in 2023. So when you look at his profile, and a lot of draft experts were a little worried because he had a lot of groin issues or something to that effect. Should we be concerned with the groin injuries? How will that translate as a pro? Do you have any thoughts on that as far as that injury goes?
Yeah, it's really tricky. And getting into the groin injury, I think looking at sort of stepping back for a second, this injury-prone idea I've always thought is kind of interesting because not all injuries, as you know, are the same. And so I just remember Rob Gronkowski breaks his forearm and has all these traumatic injuries that, are just bad luck. And so that's not really fair to be called injury-prone. Where I worry about players being injury-prone, meaning they get one injury, either they keep suffering the same injury or they get similar type of injuries, are these muscle injuries, and groin would fall into that for sure. Whether or not the ACL played a role in that or not it's really hard to know. It very likely could have if he didn't get all of his strength around the knee on that side back and it put more stress on his groin. But I do worry about hamstring, calf, sometimes quad, but maybe not as much quad, and certainly groin as being something that is really tricky. One, you don't really know 100% when it's completely healed. You can do all the MRIs you want, but at the end of the day, you've got to put somebody at full speed and all their maneuvers, and then you find out the hard way it wasn't completely healed. You end up starting all the way over. And just generally, those muscle injuries and musculotendon junction injuries are much more likely to recur in somebody that's had one than occur for the first time in somebody else that hasn't had one. And so that's where I'm sure the team is going to be very, very cautious, doing whatever they can to make absolutely sure that that's as healed as it's going to be. But it's tricky for that reason.
Gotcha. Now I have this is the big question. We got that was kind of a layup. What do you call it? A softball, if you will, a little foul tip. But anyway, this guy here, his name is Payton Wilson. He's a linebacker, and he's the talk of the town right now in IDP. He was supposed to be the number 1 linebacker coming out of college. He won the Dick Butkus Award in college, which is given to the top linebacker, obviously, right? I did the player profile on him. A couple of buddies of mine actually went and scouted him at the Senior Bowl. We all say the same thing. He's like this human highlight film for tackles. He's making one-arm tackles. He's knocking guys over. That's the pro. What's the con? Well, he has a lot of injuries, right? Yeah. He has a lot of these freak injuries from doing all these hard hitting. So he's a hard hitting player with a lot of injuries. Let me just give you a little bit of a background on Payton Wilson, okay? He had nagging issues all throughout college, like I said. But even going back, he tore his ACL his senior year in and a leg injury in 2023. Going to a grocery store and that dented can's on sale. That's who Payton Wilson, okay? Everybody's kind of worried about these injuries on a young linebacker coming in. He, maybe he's going to be a 1 year player, a couple years player, but he has a short shelf life is the moniker on him. Any thoughts with linebacker Payton Wilson, given his injury history?
Yeah, I mean, the two that I would at least inquire about, and we can talk if you want later on about what's involved in the NFL combine and the medical evaluation is pretty fascinating. But if I was a doctor evaluating him, in whichever team's room that I'm doing that, the ACL and the shoulder would be what would probably jump off the page. ACLs inherently don't bother me if the person has gotten back to 100%, and you've had evidence that they've been able to play after that and they look the same, and there was no other injury with it, be it meniscus or cartilage, the articular cartilage lining. As far as the shoulder, it really depends on what this is, and NFL teams are notorious for kind of keeping information quiet. But at that age and that activity level, very often it's a tear of the labrum, the cartilage bumper along the socket. Can do very well, there's no question. But where that potentially becomes a problem is, and I got to see what you can see on the video, but where you could potentially get your arm sort of pulled out behind you. Where that matters is going to make a tackle, the guy keeps running and pulls your arm back that way. That would worry me a little bit if that wasn't 100%. If it is, maybe it doesn't worry me so much because that surgery, again, has good success rates. But being a linebacker, maybe that worries me a little bit more, especially the shoulder, than it would, say, if he was an offensive lineman just doing things out in front of his body, or a running back. So those are kind of things that I would think about in his case. Hopefully it's all a moot point. He's going to get through all this, but that's what I'd look at.
Gotcha. Moving on from Payton Wilson, I want to talk about a couple veterans. There's a guy, if you're playing in deeper IDP formats, he's a defensive back, and his name is Caden Sterns, and we all had high hopes for him. But the issue with Caden Sterns is he hurt himself week 1 last year, and I guess the injury was called, and you'll have to school me on this, Doc, patella tendon tear. What can you tell us overall about that injury? And it happened in week 1 of last year, like I said.
Yeah, that's a tough injury. That's if you kind of feel on the front of your knee, feel your kneecap, that's the tendon that comes off right below it. It's involved in straightening your knee out. And it's sort of an all or none phenomenon. It's not a partial tear. It just completely ruptures. Now, the surgery is pretty straightforward. It's like a 45-minute surgery, but it is a long, long recovery and is probably, and it may be the number one. There was a study 5-6 years ago looking at the 8 most common injuries, and I think there was one in the NFL and one in the NBA, or 8 common injuries in those 2 sports, and what the return to sports rate at the same or higher level of sports, which is our metric for success of an operation in sports medicine. And patella tendon rupture was either the first or second worst injury to suffer in terms of getting back to the same or higher level. Really hard to get full strength back, what you had before the injury. And again, we're talking about getting back to daily activities and jogging and doing the elliptical and playing with your kids, not a big deal. Playing at an NFL level against that kind of speed and that kind of power, even a small difference makes it, you put you at a significant disadvantage. And so it's not to say that he can't get back to that level, but the success rate's typically 50, 60%. And that is really low in what we do as orthopedic surgeons.
It's interesting you said that. There's a difference between playing with your kids and playing on an NFL level with gladiators. There's a player on the Cowboys. He's a defensive tackle. And, his history shows clean bill of health, okay? But his name is Smith. And I don't know if you're familiar with the name, but last year's rookie draft class, he had this hype video. And for my audience that's on Spotify that can't see my screen, or even the people on YouTube, I challenge you, go to YouTube and watch the hype video on Mazi Smith. This guy's in the gym doing squats, 600-pound squats, just killing himself. He's just a mountain of a man. And again, clean bill of health, but big monster of a human being, constantly taking double teams. You know how that defensive tackle position goes. But my question rather, is he's recovering this offseason. He had shoulder surgery. So it's, so this is going to be his first one. I guess my question is, do you think that there's any lingering issues? Do you think there'll be a problem with that position, having shoulder injuries like that coming back? Or are you expecting to play training camp at full speed?
Yeah, I like the odds a little bit better than I would for a linebacker. Again, just because of the linebacker, a lot of times the running back or whoever it is they have to bring down is sort of out behind them. And so then you're in that, again, abducted, external rotated position that puts a lot of stress on your shoulder. Defensive tackles, a lot more of it's in front of you. So in theory, it should be a little bit better. Typically, the numbers that we give for those surgeries is 4 to 6 months back on the field. But I will tell you, NFL teams are more and more starting to push those numbers out. They would rather have somebody much more likely to be closer to 100% and healed rather than to rush somebody back too soon. I don't remember his exact timeline as far as when his surgery was, but that's what you would look at. So depending on if it was at the very end of the season, it may be training camp before they really push him out against live competition. Now, they'll have him do all sorts of rehab that stresses that going forward, but until he's in a position where he'd have to tackle and all, they'll give it as long as possible. But I like the odds certainly better than for a linebacker, maybe a cornerback, where you're really having to potentially tackle in odd positions.
Gotcha. Staying on defensive tackles, I love defensive linemen. You know, a lot of guys in the IDP community, they like linebackers. They like stuff they can grade. They say defensive linemen are wacky. I don't think so. I mean, there's a really easy formula here. A weak offensive line, a young quarterback's going to get eaten alive by these big mountain guys, right? So here's another one. This guy's name is Jeffery Simmons. He's a defensive tackle of the Titans.
Oh, I'm a big Titans fan. I know Simmons.
Oh, okay, you're familiar with the name. Good.
Yeah.
Actually, as a fantasy perspective, I'm kind of interested in him now that Aaron Donald's retired. He's probably a DT 2, 3 at the position. So I've been getting a lot of shares playing fantasy football with Simmons. As you know, like I say, he's a top player. He had an MCL sprain, and we see like this is an ongoing. This is starting to be a habit with him with the knee and the MCL sprain. Landed him on IR last year. What can you tell us about that? Is there any sort of injury problems with that? Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I will say this. I'm saying this out of no inside information, but I will, as somebody that follows the Titans a little bit more closely than other teams, just as I came from Memphis, Tennessee, so I'm a fan of different Tennessee, Memphis, and Nashville teams. Some of that, so yes, he did, have some injuries. They probably sat players more than they needed to when they realized, hey, this is a lost season. So there may have been, I don't know for sure because I wasn't in the training room, obviously, but I know they did that with some other guys. Having said that, MCL injury, that's the big, thick ligament on the inside, the side closest to the midline of your body that prevents against basically your knee opening up with cutting motion. So if you can imagine a player getting hit on the outside of the knee, that would open up the MCL on the inside. That has a very, very high healing rate. So we typically don't get concerned about that unless there's other injuries that happen at the same time. And the one you would worry about is a meniscus tear, which I have not heard that he has. That changes the dynamic completely. But typically MCLs are anywhere from 1 to 6 weeks. The problem is that's just so common in offensive and defensive linemen. And a lot of players will wear braces to try to prevent that injury. But at the end of the day, that's sort of a almost par for the course with that position group. It's going to happen at some point. So I'm not particularly worried about that. But I see, when you see it on the injury report, it's concerning. That's one to me that I wouldn't worry too much about.
Yeah. Little fun fact for you with your Titans. Last year, it was so rough. And, I don't want to kick somebody when they're down. But, and that's why I will never talk poorly about a player, especially these kids are so young and everything. But the season was a little rough last year. They actually rotated 30 different starters at one point on the defense alone. So it was like musical chairs with the Titans. And I was looking at their draft class because I was kind of interested in this. Who they bringing in? Because they got to get players. And there's a guy, I don't know if you're familiar with this rookie. His name is Sweat.
A little bit. I think what I know about him is his weight more than an injury history because that's what made all the headlines.
Yeah, I'm in this like expert IDP mock draft. All the guys in the industry, they're doing it now. And we're in the third round. And I'm like, who am I going to take? Because this isn't a strong defensive class. So I'm in the third round. I'm like, okay, the 35th player. And I'm like, I'm going to go with Sweat because he's a huge guy.
He's huge.
He's over 300 pounds. He's a big mountain guy. PFF, Pro Football, they have every major run-stopping emphasis on this guy. And put him next to Simmons or even give Simmons a little bit of a break. I think that's a player that can go in there and kind of, shuck the load a little bit for him at least. But that's a player to look out for. I'm kind of excited. The draft you just had. And then another guy you guys have is Cedric Gray. I don't know if you've heard of that linebacker.
Yeah, the North Carolina guy, yeah.
He's a top 5 linebacker, and he's known, at least to me anyway, he's one of 2 players that have 200 tackles in 2 seasons. So the sky's the limit with your team,
Yeah. I like Gray for sure. I don't know what to make of Sweat, honestly, because, I get worried when I hear somebody's work ethic and doesn't have a motor because that's hard to teach. But the flip side of it is somebody put a stat up, and again, I don't know the exact numbers, but it was basically all the defensive tackles that got drafted above him, and it listed the number of plays over the last season or the last 2 seasons, the number of plays that they were on the field. And he crushed all of them. He was on the field way more than Ruccaroro and some of these other guys. And so I think it might be a little misleading they just use the weight as a proxy for saying this guy doesn't work hard. We'll see. I mean, the Titans have drafted Isaiah Wilson out of Georgia, and he didn't play a down for us as an offensive lineman. So, I mean, we've made mistakes in the past. I'm hoping this is not one of them. But it's just really hard to grade 18 to 21-year-old guys. There's just so much going on in their lives. But you're right. The sky's the limit for that guy if he can stay healthy and keep his weight under control. I mean, if you saw the video of him running a 40, you should not be able to run that fast at 366 pounds or whatever he ran it at.
Exactly. 6'4", 366 pounds, and he's just a lightning bolt down the field. Very scary. Not known for pass rushing.
Yeah.
And a couple. I'm not that high on him, to tell you the truth. But landing spots make everything. But I have friends of mine who went down to the Senior Bowl and they scouted him and they swear by him as a top 3, top 4. My issue with this defensive tackle class, it was supposed to be an elite class 2 years ago. We got a lot of 5-star recruits and what have you. And then last year was like they had a big game, they disappeared. They had a big game, they disappeared. That tends to be, and again, that's just the position in general. They take a lot of doubles and whatnot. I had one more question for you about Simmons.
Okay.
I was reading a little bit online here, and they were saying they think that Jeffery Simmons is going to be okay because there's a lot of blood around the knee. Are you familiar with that term, blood around the knee? What does that actually mean?
Well, I don't know specifically what they were talking about in that article, but if it was in relation to his MCL, that may have been a sort of a layman's way to explain why that tends to heal versus an ACL. So the reason you have to have surgery for an ACL is it doesn't heal. When the ligament ruptures, it's sort of like a rope breaking. You get all these frayed ends, and it releases a ton of blood into the knee. And normally the blood would clot, and then the growth factors would turn it into healthy tissue. It doesn't with the ACL because all the fluid inside the joint sort of washes all that blood away. Well, the MCL is actually outside of the knee joint, and so that blood clot from the injury stays right there and gets the ligament to heal. That's why it's got a high injury rate. If it was something else, I'm not familiar with it, but that's usually how we explain why an MCL heals and an ACL doesn't.
Gotcha. I have one more player for you, and thank you for answering these. We were on the other pod the other day, me and the Fancy Six-Pack. We were talking about players to look out for. We were looking about this younger guy to 49ers. His name's Geier Brown. He's a hard-hitting tackler. Well, the question came up, well, what's wrong with Hufanga? Hufanga is known as a top 12, top 15 defensive back, depending on your position, depending on your scoring format. Because, that's another thing. In IDP, context is everything. If you're in a tackle-heavy, a guy like that's a top 15. If you're in like a interception, pass deflect league, he's a top 30. So it's like chess, not checkers. You know what I mean? So it's more like backgammon, if you will. But anyway, with Hufanga, he tore his ACL. And I think he did it around week 11 last year. So, towards their ACL, the general like rule of thumb with that? Like, we think he'll be out the whole year, or they played easy, and especially for defensive backs too. That was my question or concern.
Yeah, so it's interesting, the evolution of the ACL. It used to be one of these things that it was like 6 months and you're good to go. And we realized pretty quickly players were not ready at 6 months. Even if you can get on the field, you're just not the same. And so in the NFL, a better rule of thumb is 9 to 12 months, not from the day of injury. It's from when the surgery takes place. And again, it's not the actual amount of time. There's nothing magical about that. It's basically when you can land on it and basically control your knee and push off on that one leg and turn on that one leg and then get to football-specific activities with no deficits. And the other thing with ACLs that's a little tricky, and this is true with Tommy John surgeries in Major League Baseball, is that very often what we see with ACLs is, yes, you can go back to play that first season back, but you're not as good as you're going to be. A lot of times it's the second season back after your ACL before you look the same, before you're confident planning on it and change directions and confident landing on it and pushing off suddenly and things like that. And it's just, you can do all the physical therapy and the rehab and all the sport-specific drills, but some of it's getting back into game action and learning to trust that knee's going to be there and it's going to do what you need it to do stability-wise. And so a lot of times, and this may be a perfect case, if let's just say November, I think was when his surgery was, 9 to 12 months, potentially by training camp, he's back on the field, but it's probably going to be well into the season, if not the season after that, before he looks like the player he did before. And the challenge in the NFL is you're so teetering on the edge of somebody behind you taking your position. So that gets really tricky because the team just wants to win, whether it's with the younger guy or with you at 70% or 80%. And so those are some of the things that play into how aggressively they push him through training camp in the first few weeks of the season.
Interesting. Yeah, and that made me, a common strategy made me think of when I'm playing fantasy football, offense or defense or both were combined. I'm always looking at 2-year players because usually the ADP is so buried. I can pick up guys that no one's paying attention to before the breakout. But what you said actually brings a good point up. If I can trade for these players that I know are historically good pre-injury and hope that they're young enough that they could recover and get back to their former self, I can have some sweet deals out there. Maybe trade a draft pick or two in Dynasty.
Yeah, no, it would absolutely make sense. The other factor is you've got to have a team that's patient at least a little bit to stick with players. If they cut him, then you don't know what you're going to get. But no, I actually agree. And I will say with ACLs at least, it's one of the more predictable injuries. It's just not as quick as we would like it, but the success rates of getting back to playing at the same or higher level, this is not true at the youth level or even at the high school level, but when you talk about the NFL level, the success rates of getting back to that same or higher level are surprisingly good. I want to say it wasn't first, but it was like the second best operation in terms of that metric. So if you have the ability to be patient and you have a team that is going to give that guy a chance to 100% recover, I don't get terribly scared off by the ACLs. Where I would get scared off, again, I said this a little bit at the beginning, are the ACLs that also have a meniscus tear. If you can find this information out, that also have a meniscus tear or also have articular cartilage damage, that then makes it a lot trickier.
Gotcha. Hey, I just wanted to say thank you for coming on the show today and answering some of those questions. Again, for the audience that's not on Spotify, that can't see my screen, or the audience on YouTube, the book is called That's Gotta Hurt, The Injuries That Changed Sports Forever. Please check it out. Dr. David, can you tell the audience where they could find you? And lastly, what do you hope they gain from reading your book?
Well, I really hope that let me do what they gain from the book. I really want to get people a sense of where sports has come from and how sports and sports medicine have improved, but how far we have to go. In some ways, some of the surgeries and some of the treatments that we've done, like Tommy John surgery, in some ways have actually caused more harm than good, because now we have kids getting that injury because they think they can throw as much as they want, as hard as they want. So, I mean, that's just one example, but how things are evolving and where we need to go to decrease injuries, because it's such a key part of not just pro sports, but all the way down to our kids that play sports. So I hope you get that out of it. As far as where to find me, Dr. David Geier is my avatar handle everywhere. DrDavidGeier. You can find me on YouTube. I record videos every week, have over 100,000 followers there. Twitter, or what's X, those are probably the two I interact the most. My website, drdavidgeier.com, post a lot there, and I'm happy to help, whether it's doing videos about sports injuries or a variety of other things that I do, health and wellness and regenerative medicine and regenerative orthopedics. But love talking about this kind of thing to make it something that the average person that doesn't have a medical school background can understand. And so I think it's been really rewarding over the last, now 15 years that I've been doing this.
And that would be me. I wrote an article over at Fancy Six Pack, age cliffs, like when to get on a player, when to buy one, when to get off. But the medical stuff I know nothing about. So I'd love to have you back if you're interested. Maybe if we have some key injuries during the season, just pick your brain a little bit if you're interested. Absolutely. No, I love sports. I can talk about it all the time. So definitely reach out and we can catch up on all the latest injuries. And I'm sure it'll be interesting this year with the NFL. There's always like one key injury. It'll be Achilles injury tears one year. It'll be hamstring, right. And then teams react that goes in that you wouldn't expected, Yeah, exactly. What can we do to prevent this injury this year? And then it'll be something else next year. It's always funny to kind of watch that. So yeah, absolutely. Let's do it. Mm-hmm. And what's the name of your YouTube channel again? It's youtube.com/Dr. David Geier, DrDavidGeier. I was lucky enough to start doing YouTube before they made these random handles and stuff. So I got my name before it got difficult. So what can you do? There you go. Excellent. Well, anyway, again, thanks for coming on, guys. Thanks for listening. Check out the book. We'll have other shows for you guys next week. Appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. David. Y'all have a good night.